Bang, Neeves Knives. I'm Jared. My lovely wife, Kara, is busy. And in this video, it's basically just going to be a little bit of a rant. I have a bunch of knives I'm going to pull forward and show knives that make sense and kind of talk about why they make sense. Because there are so many knives in 2021. And, you know, if you go back through the years, so many knife companies have come out with knives, whether budget or expensive, high-end, USA-made knives, so many knives. But a lot of companies are making knives that just don't make sense. And this is mostly going to be from the tool aspect of a knife and the user aspect, like how they are as a tool. So, the Demco 8020 is a knife that makes sense to me. Even though this knife wouldn't make sense if I was going to say, oh, this is going to be my slicer. Well, no. But as a tough, robust, hardcore knife, this makes sense. It's a very thick blade stock. The geometry is not great on it, but it is built for hard use. Now, it supports itself with this incredible strong lock. Now, if they put this incredible strong lock, say, on a knife or on this knife, and it wound up being a blade stock thickness of 100 thousandths, it wouldn't make sense. Why would you need a lock so strong on a blade that is problematic to snap, meaning the blade can't even hold and the kind of weight that the lock can. In this configuration, this makes this knife extremely robust. Now, for a slicer version, they do have the budget version coming out, which is going to be thinner and a little bit lighter duty, a little bit better for, say, all-around tasks more than just hard use. And this is still a great knife for cutting. Even though the geometry is not the best, it's still, because of the way they did the taper and everything, it actually cuts very well. I showed it in my review that it actually cuts extremely well. But the one thing that it does do even better is it does toughness. Just very tough, robust, and ready for anything. This is a knife that can take a lot of abuse, but if the blade didn't match the lock and the construction, then it wouldn't be able to take as much abuse without the blade snapping. So between the blade and the handle, it makes sense. Now, another one kind of similar to that one, the Hinderer XM24. Now, a lot of people would say this is overkill. And in a lot of ways, I would agree. Of course, it's overkill for your regular heavy-duty pocket knife, but as a robust, hard-use, tough knife that you can put through anything, it's a great example. The blade, nice and thick. The geometry, not the best. It's more of a thicker geometry. It still cuts very well, considering. And the frame and the whole build of it is extremely robust. Now, this one happens to have the carbon fiber scale, but not for long. And inside it has a titanium liner just to add to the strength and the robustness. And, the hardware, lots of hardware. The stop pin is the thumb studs, so nice big stop pin / thumb studs. And it's just a very robust knife that makes sense for a knife this size that's supposed to take the amount of abuse that this knife is supposed to take. Well, it can, because of the way it's built between the handle and the blade put together. It is built very tough. That was the Hinderer XM24. Now, another one that's also very tough, not quite as tough, but is kind of giving you a little bit more EDC friendly, a little bit better cutting performance, the Malice. This is a ferrum forged design. Now, these are solid titanium scales. They're not milled at all. Very, very strong. Nice big hardware. Full back spacer. So the construction of the handle is extremely strong. So to support this level of strength, it does have a reasonably thick blade stock. But the geometry gets down to a nice edge, a very slicey edge. And It gives you great ergos while giving you good cutting performance while not sacrificing any strength. I mean, it's a very tough. This is a great example of a hard use knife that's also a good slicer. Now, sometimes that is one of my biggest arguments is companies thinking that the only way for them to make a hard use knife is to make it not be able to cut, basically. And the next knife is going to be a great example of how that's not true. Now we have the Sabenza 21. Very, very toughly built frame with a reasonably thick blade stock, you know, but it gets down to nice and thin behind the edge, especially for the geometry of the blade. Very tall, hollow ground blade. And this executes what they were going for very nicely. It makes it to where you're going to have a great work knife, a knife that can be repeatedly sharpened over and over and over and not affect the geometry. The geometry will still stay the same. It'll actually get a little bit better because it actually gets a little bit thinner before it gets thicker when you start going up the blade. You can see that sharpening choil is actually even hidden, or not sharpening choil, the plunge grind is actually underneath the scale. You can't even see it. So they gave you all this life to sharpen, and the blade shape is very good. Nice neutral ergos. It's going to be a great work knife. It makes sense as a tool and as a knife that's going to last a very long time as a tool and a companion. And let's not forget about steels. Steel is extremely important because we're using a lot of exotic, very exotic super steels that have crazy amounts of toughness and edge retention. So we should be getting the most performances possible out of that steel. Say if it's going to be a slicer and we're using, say, M390, well, that knife can get very thin then because it can, you know, that steel can support that. Now, if it's going to be a robust knife, then it should be using a steel that supports a steel and grind that supports it being robust. But if we're going to use and even more importantly, the heat treat should be executed good. But if we're going to use these steels, these super exotic steels that are very tough and have great edge retention, well, then we should be able to grind them in a way to get the best level of performance out of that steel. Vivipicaro. Yes, it's a large knife, but they're not trying to make a large, robust knife. This is a large slicer. Now, the liner lock isn't going to support a blade stack thickness of 200 thousandths. So why put it on there? No, they put a nice thin slicey blade on there, nice deep hollow ground blade. Now people look at this hole and say, oh, well, it's not tough. It's not going to handle batoning. Well, neither is the lock. It's not made for batoning. This is made as an EDC tool to cut, to slice. If you want a baton, get a triad lock, get a shark lock. Get a fixed blade. How about that? Get a fixed blade because it's not made for that. And what it does is, let's say you baton your knife. Okay, you baton your knife. How much cutting do you do with your knife? Because that's what they're made for. So are you doing 90% cutting, 10% batoning? Well, in my opinion, I would rather that knife cut very well rather than baton very well. Then if batoning is, I've never grabbed a folder and batoned with it because I needed to. Never, not one time. I will pick up little sticks and build a fire if I need to build a fire. And if I really needed to baton, I would use a fixed blade. I wouldn't pull out my folder out of my pocket and start batoning with it. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't grabbed a knife and, notched out some wood with it, but I'm using the front end. I'm not putting a lot of force on the lock, and it's a small bit. My knife will be able to handle it. But it doesn't make sense to make a knife not cut very well just so you can baton when you rarely baton. That doesn't make sense to me. Make my knife cut very well. That's what I want. Unless if it's made for robustness. If it's made for robustness, now that's another story. As long as the lock and handle will support it. So I think that, in my opinion, if I'm buying a knife as a tool, I want it to make as much sense as possible between the blade, the handle, the lock, the ergos, the steel, the grind, the choil. I want all those things to make sense for what that knife is used for. Spyderco Manics 2, another one in my opinion that it's a great knife that makes sense. The ball lock is a very, very strong locking mechanism. Now, just because it's very strong doesn't mean they had to put a 200,000 thick blade. No, they still made it reasonably slicey. This is a great example of geometry and strength put together well. I don't see these blades snapped all over the place. I'm sure there are some out there, but this is a 130,000 thick blade with a nice tapering blade, but it gets down to a reasonably decent edge for slicing and cutting. It's a great mid-range knife between strength and cutting performance. So yeah, what a great knife. I love this knife. I think they executed it very well. There's many different examples of this. They have lightweight versions, G10 versions. This one has the Flytanium scales with the Flytanium cage. Now I wasn't a big fan of the plastic cage, but, you know, it is still reasonably strong. But, yeah. And even S30V, I like S30V. I think S30V is a great steel. Now, another one, the TRM Shadow, is another great example of a knife that it has a strong locking mechanism, but it's not really built for just hard use strength. Yes, it's a very, very tough knife, but they didn't go and put a crazy thick blade stock. They gave you a nice thin blade, which is, I think, 90 thousandths, which is going to pass through material so easily with almost a full flat grind. It's not quite a full flat, but it gives you great cutting geometry while also giving you strength. Is it going to be a pry bar? No, but for your pressure going down and up to pull out of cuts, it's going to be super strong and carry very well. Nice sharpening choil, nice blade shape. They just executed it very, very well, in my opinion. And if we pull up the Benchmade Griptilian, a knife I love, okay, I love this, but I think they kind of missed the goal on this with the geometry of this blade. Look at the blade stock difference in thickness, and then behind the edge thickness, it's pretty thick. This could be so much better. Now, is it still a great knife? Yes, I love this knife, but if they would have kept their hollow ground blade, it would be so much better than it is in today's version of it. I don't know why they ever stopped that. That was the best part about this knife. But since they did stop that, now, to me, a knife like this is going to far, far exceed its performance. This is a way better version of that knife. Very comfortable in the hand, very well built, great tolerances. Yeah. Now, another great work knife, and a knife that's just good as a tool, the Spyderco Gail Bradley. This isn't trying to be pretty, it's not trying to be beautiful, it's not trying to have amazing action or anything like that. I might actually increase the D10 strength on this, but the ergos are very straightforward, very comfortable in the hand. The one ball that they did miss is they didn't give you good access to the lock bar that I did have to modify to make it better. But the blade to handle makes sense. And very thin behind the edge. An incredible slicer. And this is another one. You don't see these things broke all over the place because they snapped or something. But even though they gave you such a, or since they gave you such a thin grind down here, they also gave you M4 steel. M4 steel holds an incredible edge, and it makes it to where this knife is a great work knife, because that's another thing, is having the steel to support the knife that we're talking about, or the blade that we're talking about on that knife. this is a great example of a knife well done for a cutting performing tool. Now, going towards the same thing, just a more budget-friendly option, the Savivi Elementum button lock. Regardless of the, how you feel about the button and the action, which I don't mind at all. It's just fine. Yes, I would prefer some sort of deployment option, but the blade to handle makes sense. Nice, thin, deep, hollow ground blade on their 14C28N that they heat treated between 61 and 63 HRC, and it shows. They did an incredible job, in my opinion, on their 14C28N steel. So that's a great steel for this blade. It's very tough. It holds a good edge. It's easy to sharpen. It takes an incredible edge, and this handle is a very neutral handle. It makes sense with this blade. It's very straightforward, and it's just a great tool. I love using this knife because of those reasons. It works. It really works together perfectly as a tool. Now, for something lightweight, yet still tough enough to do, any task, basically, we have the Real Steel Luna Boost. Now, there's nothing glorious about this with action or anything like that, but a very, very tough frame lock, very good, strong build, and the lockup is very strong, yet the blade is very nice and slicey for the size. Now, they could have crapped the bed if they would have put a very thick blade on this. It wouldn't have made sense. On small handle that you're not getting the best grip on with a thick blade, that would have made this ridiculous. But since they did give you a nice slicey blade, nice and thin behind the edge, it makes this blade pass through materials very easily, where you don't need to have, say, a Benchmade Griptilian kind of grip on your knife to get through materials. So this is a very good example of a knife that's just, it makes sense. It makes sense. Now, another one, regardless of the issues that I did have with it, the Quiet Carry Waypoint is another one. The blade is very, very thin, nice deep hollow grind, so it's very slicey. It's not trying to be a robust knife at all, which it shouldn't be, because the handle doesn't support this knife being a robust knife. So since the handle doesn't support it being a robust knife, the blade should be thin and slicey. I think most blades should be thin and slicey. They are cutting tools, but when we're talking about robust knives with robust handles that give you an incredible amount of grip and strength, and the lock supports it, well, then you can understand having a thick blade on it because it supports it. And in this case, that's not what they were going for. They're going for a straightforward EDC knife, very corrosion resistant, a great steel, very slicey, very easy to carry, compact, and it makes sense. Now, there's going to be lots of knives that kind of go beyond just being a great tool. They look good. You like to carry them. They're awesome knives, and the Olamic Whippersnapper is a great example of that. You can get a good amount of ergos on this. The blade shape makes sense for the handle, but it still makes sense even though they're not going for a straight tool. This is more of a luxury item EDC. It's a beautiful blade to carry. You can customize them and get them dressed up the way you want, kind of a dress piece, yet still extremely functional while not sacrificing any of the build quality. These things are built extremely well, very tight tolerances, and they feel like a high-end knife, which they are, but they don't, it doesn't mean that they had to go and make a ridiculous knife that just sucks to use. Now, I would argue that the busker is kind of that. I think the busker is basically everything I'm talking about right now. It's very thick blade. It doesn't make sense. The blade doesn't make sense for the handle. Not saying it's not going to be useful, and since it is kind of more of a luxury piece, that's where you can kind of you know, kind of look away a little bit. It's not really trying to be a tool. It's more or less, you know, a take out of your pocket, make a cut, put it back type of thing. But you guys see where I'm going with this. Thank you guys for watching. I love you guys.